something happened, and then he woke up the next morning in his bed with all of his clothes on and his shoes and everything in his bed, and couldn't remember what had happened.
But when he says she, is he talking about like a being or a UFO?
It was interesting. That was all that he said. And so I said, okay, John, I said, I guess that's it. We'll come back when they're ready. And so John ends up assigning me to interview all of the major experts in the world, because we had all the financing we need from Lawrence Rockefeller. We had Harvard University as our faculty.
A Gilded Age family, I gotta say it.
So which Gilded, which one?
I mean, the same kind of idea. Like we were talking about the Mellons earlier. Now the Rockefellers are getting involved. Like
he's going to pay for it. He's going to pay for it.
Yeah, why?
Well, because as it turns out, because his best friend, who actually was the Prince of Liechtenstein, to be clear about it, according to Lawrence, that his best friend had actually put his hand right on one. He was hiking in the mountains, somewhere in Europe, and here was a UFO sitting right in the middle of this meadow, and he went over and put his hand on it and knew that it was absolutely real, and he told Lawrence Rockefeller about it. And so he was absolutely convinced that this was real. He said, and this is outrageous. He said that for them to be keeping this secret. And so he agreed to finance the whole thing.
And John sent you to talk to every expert in the world. Like who?
So I got to talk to Bud Hopkins. I got to talk to David Jacobs. I got to talk to Stanton Friedman. I got to talk to, Stephen Greer. I got to talk to Linda Moulton Howe. I got to talk to all kinds of, almost all the experts you could possibly think of. Okay, in starting the head of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Agency, the chief investigator for them. I got to talk to Arnie Arnoldson, who was the commander of the Maelstrom base. I got to start lining up all these people just like a regular trial.
And what were your conclusions based on all those conversations from like a high level? What were your broad conclusions?
Well, I also, it was interesting. John also had this thing called the peer group, which was the Project for Extraordinary Experience Research. So there were actual contactees, lots of regular people, contactees that he had interviewed down through the 3 or 4 years prior to writing the book, right? And so I got to interview these people too, and I got to vet them and talk with them and interrogate them, examine them, etc.
What did you think of them? Credible?
I vetted a number of these people and got to the ones that I thought were absolutely credible, cross-examined them and verified from my own belief that they had these encounters. And so I was saying, this is really far out. I'm in a position to actually talk to the leading experts in the entire world, and actual people who've had these direct encounters. And they've been vetted through to me from Dr. Mack, and I can see their psychological profile. So I know that they're within the normal parameters of normal people, and so I'm starting to put together all of these witnesses. So I ended up in this kind of extraordinary position of knowing all of this stuff. And so I had no doubt at all that this was true, right? I'd already seen the photographs of the crash recovery back in '77. So here I was now meeting all of these different people, and I got to talk to David Jacobs, who was terribly worried about the abductions that were going on and the breeding program that was going. So I was getting all the different positions that people had on this.
You said you used the word contactees when you're talking about who you were talking with, but did that also include people who claimed to have been abducted?
Yes. Oh, yeah. They were experiencers. They were people who had been abducted and taken aboard the craft, had undergone medical experiments and stuff. Some of them.
Do you have an example from those conversations?
Oh, sure.
Can you give that?
Yeah, there's a young guy that was he was like 32, 33-year-old guy. He was a contractor up in New Hampshire. And he had come home from work one Friday evening, and he lived out in kind of a rural area up in New Hampshire. And he was coming back home, and he was going to sit down and kind of watch like Washington Week in Review or something on the local television. And he was making himself a little TV dinner, and he set the little table up, and he was getting set to watch this. And he thought he saw somebody out on the porch, out on his side porch. And he was out in a rural area, and so he gets up and goes out and looks. There's nobody there. And he comes back and sits down and starts to watch the show again. He gets this feeling there's somebody out there, and he gets up and he goes out to the kitchen, and he goes out into the kitchen and he looks out through the window and there she was. Yeah, there she was. He said, and that was the last thing he could remember.
Who
So
was?
it was the last thing that's all that's all he thought. He said something happened, and then he woke up the next morning in his bed with all of his clothes on and his shoes and everything in his bed, and couldn't remember what had happened.
But when he says she, is he talking about like a being or a UFO?
It was interesting. That was all that he said, and he went and told his friend about it, who was a psychologist, because it kept nagging at him because he couldn't figure out what the heck happened to him, because he woke up the next morning in his own bed with his clothes on and everything. And so his friend, after 2 or 3 different episodes of him expressing how distressed he was about all this, said, well, look, there's a guy down in Cambridge that's actually interviewing people who think that they've had some kind of a lost time thing, and you ought to go down and talk to him. So he goes down to talk to John. And so John brings him home and brings him to his house and puts him on his little couch. I've been there 100 times, and sits down and does this holotropic breathing thing, not hypnosis, but this kind of relaxing breathing. Yep. And he takes him back through the whole episode, and he gets back to the kitchen, right? And he walks out in the kitchen and he says, and there she is. And John says, who are we talking about here? And he said, well, there she was. She was looking through the window. And John said, well, who is it? What do they look like? And he said, well, she's got the big head and the big kind of dark eyes, kind of wraparound eyes and little holes. And John says, wait a second, is this like a person or something that you're saying? He said, no, it was like this ET person. And John said, well, wait a second, what happened? What happened then? He said, well, she kind of telepathically suggested I come outdoors. So I went outdoors. She led me out through the field. She brought me in, and we went inside this great big saucer that was out in the middle of the meadow, and brought me in and had me take off all my clothes, did this physical exam of me, and did all this. And he goes through the details. And so John gets all done with this session with the guy. And then the guy comes back a couple of weeks later.
And John believes it.
Well, it sounded completely credible to John. I mean, the guy had all kinds of the proper emotions and everything that were going with it. So John is kind of puzzled by this. So he asks the guy to come back, and he comes back a couple of weeks later, and he takes him through the same thing. He gets set to eat his meal. He thinks somebody's on the porch. He goes over to the kitchen, and there she is. And so John said, wait a second. He said, now, when you said, and there she is, it sounded like, did you recognize her? And the guy said, yes, I did. He said, well, John said, well, where had you seen her before? And he said, well, actually, I had seen her before back when I was in college. He said, I was coming home from her long weekend. It was like a holiday weekend or something. I was driving back home from down in Boston where I was in school, and I was driving along, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was coming near the house, and all of a sudden I saw this little craft like land in the field. So I stopped the car and I got out and I walked out into the field, and there she was. And he said, what happened? Well, she took me on board and she gave me this physical examination and stuff. And he goes through this entire story, right? And so John's going, well, this is really interesting. So you had twice you've been abducted by this same person. And he said, yeah. And so John said to him, I said, look, when you walked out into the field and you saw her, was she familiar? Is that the first time you ever saw her? And he said, no, I recognized her right away. And John said, well, when had you seen her before? And he said, well, it said when I was a little kid, I was like about 4 or 5 years old. My sister, who was like 6 years old at the time, she and I were out with our mother and father. We were having a picnic. And my sister and I were out playing in the meadow, and we kind of wandered off to the edge of the woods, and there she was standing by this tree. And my sister and I went over and talked to her, and we played, and she talked with us and stuff. And
with them telepathically?
Communicated with her telepathically, she said, or he said. And then so John was excited. He said, oh, then your sister saw her too? he said, oh, yes. He said, but she won't talk about it. She refuses to talk. She's never going to talk about this. And John said, well, look, let me call her. Let me give her. He said, she won't talk about it. And he said, well, just let me try. So John gets the phone number. He calls her up and he says, hello, my name is Dr. John Mack. I'm the chairman of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And I've been talking to your brother here. And he indicates that he thinks he has a memory of there being some event that took place when he was 4 years old. She said, I'm not going to talk about it.
Oh my
And
God.
he said, well, look, I'm just trying to get no, I told him, I'm never going to talk about this, period. I'm not going to talk with you as long as she hangs up the phone. And so John is kind of getting confirmation from her that this has happened, right? And so this is one of the kind of people that John had interviewed. The reason I remember this is because Michael Lindemann had called my attention to this particular event. And what had happened, John then goes back and asks him again. He says, okay, now let's talk about this again. So he has like a fourth interview with this guy. He said, okay, now you're 4 years old and your sister's 6 years old. You're out in the meadow. You're walking around. You see this lady standing over by the tree. Now, let me tell you, you look at the lady. Did you recognize her? He said, yeah. Yeah, he said, I recognized her. My sister recognized her too. He said, well, when had you seen her before this? And he said, well, I'm sitting in this room, and the room is like a small room, and it's got like stones. The walls are made out of stones, and there's this kind of window here, and I'm getting set to. I'm talking with this ET lady, and she's saying it's perfectly okay. Look at you, did the best you could. You tried to get the owner of the land here to give the people that were working on the land more of their food that they were growing for them, and now you're getting set to be executed. But you've done the right thing. And here he is talking about this prior life. And all of a sudden he's sharing this information about him having a previous encounter with this being in a previous life. Just bang like that, and John is going, whoa, what is this? And so I remember that particular one.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.